terms of migration, are you confident that if you need to, you can switch providers very easily? You can take, you know, all of those virtualized services en masse and just switch them to another provider?
Depending how that service provider hosts that service, yes. I mean, the ability to move virtual machines between servers and between data centers is extremely easy. And there was one thought with regards to having a third party provide essentially a DC3, so that if one of the main ones failed, we could fail over to some other party's hardware. Yeah. I think the issue is more around the data. Yeah. Whilst Barclays is not an organisation that has to have its information in the UK, the accessibility of that data, the performance to get to that data, particularly for services that have ODBC links or are providing web or sales services, and the ability to extract that data at the end of the contract, or should there be issues within the contract, is a key focus.
Yeah, okay, okay. All right. Extracting data at the end of the contract, Nigel. Is this something which is easy to do? What sort of guarantees are in place? What sort of laws make sure that that has to happen? Is this something that has to be written into the contract, into the SLAs from the start to make sure it can happen?
I think Doug's right that the data is one of the main concerns about anyone who's putting their infrastructure into the cloud and putting their data into the cloud, because you're entrusting your potentially hugely valuable data to a third party. And so one can see clear commercial concerns there, both in terms of putting the data into the infrastructure and then on exit getting that data out, as well as during the course of the contract ensuring that you have adequate backups of the data. And in terms of contractual provisions, some of the cloud contracts I've looked at do contain some fairly horrendous clauses in the default standard T&Cs about data on exit. Particularly areas like if the contract terminates in potentially contentious situations, perhaps where there's a default on one side or another, the service provider retains the right to delete the data. Obviously, whatever the circumstances of the contract being terminated, the customer usually wants to have access to the data one way or another, either through the backups that they've been retaining or some sort of data export. Yeah. So it's pretty key and fundamental that that be addressed in the contract, whatever the circumstances of termination, that the service provider be required to cooperate fairly with either the client or a new service provider in enabling that data can be exported in appropriate formats and so on.
In your experience, what flexibility do customers have in negotiating with service providers? I mean, for instance, I read Amazon's Clause 11. We're not going to be signing up to that anytime soon, but I can't imagine Amazon being too flexible to us as a customer to make any changes.
Yes, I think that's right. Where you're getting involved in a commodity type service like that, which is a sort of one-to-many type service, then you're reliant on standard T&Cs, which may be very difficult to negotiate. But where you're dealing with a more substantive contract, more complex, then get into the contractual process early on. Sometimes we see people say, well, we decided to do this, and the contract is sort of almost the last thing they look at. Actually, it's better to get that process much earlier on and address the issues. So
it splits the market up into cloud providers for small to medium businesses and cloud providers for large corporates.
Yes.
Or public versus private, I think. Yeah. That's one of the key issues. You can't build as many SLAs into a public, a public service in comparison with a private service. 'Cause it sounds like, Joe, what you did is more or less built a private client service, and I guess characterised with all the SLAs and the kind of things you'd have when it was on premise.
For all of our sort of cloud-based web services that we're doing, that is effectively private, and it's a similar situation with, I mean, our sort of key. If you think about what we've got in Frankfurt, which is all of our Micros sort of applications, which has every transaction running through it, for anyone staying on property. That again it's within their sort of environment, but it's a private database within that, and it's quite right what Nigel said. That's one of the first things that we look at very early on in any sort of a hosting or sort of cloud type environment, is looking at, because that data is always our data, and so we interrogate any SLA and sort of contract, and you know, because whilst you might think you're going to be sort of happy and merry and partners all the way along, you know, it's the real world in commercial terms, and companies do go under.
Yeah. But you're a big company doing a big contract. I think that's probably, in a sense, there's old wine new bottles here, because it's exactly as you're saying, the extent to which you want a bespoke contract is entirely a function of price. So if it's a big enough deal, you'll have a negotiation. If it's a small deal, you'll take it as is, and the terms might be as is. And as long as the stars align in that the actual data, as you're saying, is not so regulated or sensitive that you can live with it, then the off-the-shelf package with the horrendous terms, you'll go for it.
It depends on the type of service as well. If you're using software as a service, then typically the data's in a bespoke format, and it's very much mixed in with other people's data. Even if you get it back, it may be no use to you. If you're using infrastructure as a service, you can create more separation. You can start to use encryption to keep your stuff so that only you can access it. So even if your company deletes it, at least you've stopped them gaining access to it, and then you can safely back it up because it's already encrypted, and you don't worry how many copies you create, and it's easier to deal with. But then you've got to do more of the work yourselves because it's infrastructure and less compared to SaaS. So it's all a balance, and it definitely depends on company size dramatically as to how you can influence what's going on.
And I think if I just jump in, I think it's also dependent on how you want to engage. So if you want to engage directly, or you want to work with somebody who's going to provide a service that may include multiple service providers, and then they take some of the management, they'll address some of the SLA issues and the contractual issues and so forth. So it's the complexities whether or not you want to do that yourself, or you want to work with a third party managed service company, whatever that is, to help you get there.
Because you're absolutely right, because if it's a stack, as Doug was saying, it's all about back-to-back arrangements, and you're kind of driven by what's already there. And so if at the end of the stack is some as-is, where-is, anyone that's stepping a little bit further forward than that, offering some service levels, is doing it at risk. So you can hit a wall sometimes in the negotiation because it can't be backed off.